Imagine a man, his body shattered by years of torture, the last Grand Master of the Knights Templar, tied to a stake with flames licking at his feet. The crowd expects him to scream for mercy. Instead, he raises his head. With his final breath, he doesn't plead for his life. He judges his enemies. He summons the Pope and the King of France who betrayed him, condemning them to face God's wrath alongside him, within 1 year. They thought they were just burning a man. They had no idea they were unleashing a curse that would topple a dynasty. Jacques de Molay, the 23rd and final Grand Master of the Knights Templar, stood upon the scaffold erected on a small island in the heart of the Seine. It was the 18th day of March in the year 1314. His gaze was fixed upon the crowd gathered on the bank and on the majestic towers of Notre Dame Cathedral. He saw neither sympathy nor hatred in the faces of the Parisians, only a vacant curiosity. They had come for a spectacle, a brief diversion from their daily toil. The burning of a heretic was a form of theater, and he was the final actor in a play written by a king and a pope. The Grand Master felt an immense solitude, a gulf between his truth and their idle entertainment. The years of torture in the royal dungeons had not broken his spirit, but they had betrayed his body, turning the once mighty warrior into a shadow of his former self. His limbs ached with the memory of the rack, and his skin bore the pale, crisscrossed patterns of old wounds. He was a ruin, a testament to the cruelty of men who served greed, not God. Yet, his mind was not on the pain that awaited him in the flames. It was drifting back across the decades of faithful service to the crown and the church. He remembered the blood spilled in their name, the holy lands he had fought to defend, and the immense trust placed in his order. A trust that had ultimately become the very reason for his and its destruction. He thought of King Philip, a man whose piety was a mask for an insatiable avarice. The king's coffers were empty, drained by endless wars, and the Templar treasury had been a temptation too great to resist. The charges of heresy were a convenient lie, a shroud of righteousness to cover the cold steel of theft and murder. Philip's justice was bought with gold and sealed with fire. And he thought of Pope Clement, a man who wore the fisherman's ring but served the King of France. He had been a reed in the wind, bending to Philip's will, sacrificing the loyal soldiers of Christ to secure his own fragile power. He had sanctioned the arrests, blessed the inquisitors, and would now watch them burn, his conscience a distant and muffled bell. Memories of the East flooded his mind, the blinding sun on the sands of Palestine, the clang of sword on shield, the camaraderie of brothers united by a sacred oath. They had been the bulwark of Christendom, its sword and its shield. They had managed wealth not for their own luxury, but to fund the holy wars, to ransom captives, and to build fortresses against the enemies of the faith. This very wealth, so carefully guarded and administered, had become their curse. It had painted a target on their backs, stirring envy in the hearts of princes. Philip saw not a sacred trust, but a hoard to be plundered. The order's discipline and secrecy, once virtues, were twisted into proof of conspiracy and dark rituals in the minds of the greedy. He would never forget that dawn. Friday, the 13th of October, in the year 1307. The coordinated arrests across all of France had been executed with chilling precision. They were dragged from their beds, these aged warriors and young novices, bewildered by the accusations of men they had served and protected. Betrayal had come like a thief in the night. Then came the endless years in darkness. The questions of the inquisitors, their voices dripping with false piety as they demanded confessions to unspeakable acts. Spitting on the cross, worshipping an idol, sodomy. The words were poison, designed to break the strongest will. Many brothers, their bodies broken by torture, had confessed to lies just to make the agony stop. He too had faltered. In a moment of supreme weakness, under the tormentor's relentless hand, a confession had been wrung from him. That shame had been a heavier burden than any chain. But he had been granted one last chance to reclaim his honor, and the honor of his slain and scattered brothers. He had taken it, standing before the cardinals to revoke that false testimony. By recanting his confession, he had proclaimed the order's innocence, but he had also sealed his own fate. Under the cruel logic of the Inquisition, a recanted confession made one a relapsed heretic, for whom there was no mercy. The sentence had been immediate, death by fire, to be carried out that very day. There would be no more appeals, no more years languishing in a cell. He felt the cold March wind cut through his thin tunic, pulling him back to the present. Beside him stood Geoffroy de Charny, preceptor of Normandy, his brother in arms and now his brother in death. They exchanged a look, not of despair, but of shared resolve. They knew this end was not a defeat, but a martyrdom. Their testimony would not be written by scribes, but in smoke and flame. The executioners moved about the pyre, their movements methodical and unhurried. They stacked the wood with a craftsman's care, ensuring it would burn slowly, prolonging the spectacle for the crowd on the shore. The scent of the river mingled with the dry smell of the timber, a final earthly perfume before the stench of burning flesh would fill the air. He raised his eyes one last time toward the facade of Notre Dame. For 2 centuries, his order had been the rock upon which the church's ambitions in the East were built. Now, in the shadow of its greatest cathedral, that rock was to be ground into ash. He took a slow, deep breath, gathering the last of his strength not to endure the pain, but to deliver his final judgment. When the flame touched his feet, he made no sound. The lick of heat, the first sharp bite of pain that should have drawn a scream, was met with an unnerving stillness. Instead, he raised his head, and when he spoke, his voice, miraculously strong, carried across the water, silencing the expectant murmur of the crowd in an instant. He did not beg for mercy or offer any final, desperate defense. His words were not for the Parisians gathered on the bank, nor for the executioners who tended the pyre. He was addressing a higher authority, his tone not that of a supplicant, but of an accuser before the ultimate tribunal. He was calling to account those who had orchestrated his downfall. "Hear me, from this fire and from this death." His voice rang with the clarity of a trumpet, cutting through the heavy March air. "The order is pure, the order is holy. The accusations laid against us are the foulest of lies, born from the avarice of a faithless king and the weakness of a compliant pontiff." A wave of shock rippled through the assembled throng. This was not the broken mumbling of a condemned heretic, it was the thunderous proclamation of a man utterly convinced of his own righteousness. The soldiers shifted uneasily, their hands tightening on the hafts of their pikes. This was not proceeding as planned. He then fixed his gaze, not on the people, but on some unseen point in the heavens, as if he could see the celestial court already in session. His voice dropped slightly, yet lost none of its carrying power, taking on the chilling cadence of prophecy. He was no longer a defendant, he had become the judge. "Pope Clement," he cried out, naming the first of his betrayers. "Before 40 days have passed, I summon you to appear before the judgment seat of God to receive what you are due for the injustices you have wrought upon my brothers and upon me. You will answer for your broken vows." A collective gasp arose from the shore. To summon the Vicar of Christ himself to divine judgment was an act of audacious, almost unthinkable defiance. It bordered on blasphemy, yet the sheer conviction in his voice lent it a terrifying weight. The words felt less like a curse and more like a pronouncement of an inevitable sentence. Then, he turned his focus to the architect of his ruin. "And you, King Philip." The name was spat out like poison, echoing with years of betrayal. "Instrument of this injustice. I summon you as well. Within this year, you will follow the Pope and stand with me before the highest judge of all, to answer for your crime. You and your lineage." The silence that followed was absolute, deeper than any that had come before. It was as if the city itself held its breath. The king, the embodiment of divine right, summoned to die by a burning man. The prophecy hung in the air, a chilling portent that settled into the hearts of all who heard it. The spectacle had become a sermon of damnation. The flames, indifferent to human drama, continued their work. They climbed from his ankles to his knees, charring the rough spun cloth of his tunic. He did not flinch. His face, illuminated by the rising inferno, showed no trace of agony. There was only a profound and terrible resolve, the look of a man who had already passed beyond the reach of worldly pain. He was no longer just a man on a pyre, he had become a symbol of defiance against temporal power. In his final moments, he had transformed the instrument of his shame into a pulpit, and the crowd of gawkers into his unwilling congregation. He had planted a seed of doubt and fear that would long outlive his own ashes. Beside him, Geoffroy de Charny met his own end with the same silent fortitude, his gaze locked with his Grand Master's in a final, unspoken affirmation of their shared innocence. Their martyrdom was their last act of service to the order, a final testament written not in ink, but in fire and courage. It was a defiant display of loyalty. The fire roared now, a hungry beast consuming the dry wood and the men bound to it. The heat washed over the front ranks of the crowd on the riverbank, forcing them to take a step back. They watched, mesmerized and horrified, as the figures on the pyre were slowly transformed into blackened, incandescent silhouettes against the darkening sky. For a moment that stretched into an eternity, Jacques de Molay's head remained raised, his eyes still seemingly fixed on the towers of Notre Dame. He was a torch of righteous fury, his physical form being destroyed even as his will imposed itself upon the memory of Paris. He was giving his life to purchase his vindication. Then, with a great groan of tortured timber, the central post of the pyre gave way. The burning structure collapsed inward, and the last Grand Master of the Knights Templar was consumed entirely by the vortex of flame. There was no final cry, no death rattle, only the hungry crackle of the fire and the whisper of the wind over the Seine. The show was over. But no one cheered. The crowd stood for a long time in stunned silence, the Grand Master's words echoing in their minds. The prophecy felt too real, too powerful to be dismissed as the ravings of a dying man. They looked at each other, their faces pale in the firelight, a shared unease passing between them. Slowly, in small, quiet groups, they began to disperse. They walked away not with the satisfied thrill of having witnessed justice done, but with the cold dread of having witnessed an omen. The air was thick with more than just smoke, it was heavy with the weight of the curse, a pronouncement that would now be measured against the calendar. The royal guards maintained their positions, but their usual swagger was gone, replaced by a grim watchfulness. Even they seemed shaken by the sheer force of the dead man's conviction. They had executed a heretic according to the law of the king, but many now wondered if they had instead murdered a saint and damned their own souls. As darkness fell completely over the city, the executioners began their final, grim task. They sifted through the cooling embers, gathering the bones and ashes of the two men. Their orders were clear, nothing was to remain. No relic for the superstitious, no grave for a martyr. All that was left was to be cast into the river and washed away. The last of the ashes were swept into a sack and tipped unceremoniously into the dark, flowing water of the Seine. The current took them, dispersing the last physical traces of Jacques de Molay. But his final words could not be so easily disposed of. They remained, clinging to the stones of the city, an echo of defiance and a prophecy of doom, waiting only for time to reveal its truth. Not a month had passed before the news reached Paris. A rider, his horse lathered in sweat and his face grim, brought the sealed dispatch from Avignon. Pope Clement V was dead. The news spread through the corridors of the Louvre Palace not like a trumpet blast of state, but like a venomous whisper, passed from one courtier to another behind cupped hands. He had died in agony. The official reports spoke of a sudden and severe malady, but the secret letters carried more gruesome details. A fire in the gut, a disease that had consumed him from the inside out, leaving his body a withered husk. The physicians had been powerless, watching in horror as the Vicar of Christ was devoured by an unseen enemy. At King Philip's court, the whispers were laced with a name, Jacques de Molay. Men and women who had stood on the banks of the Seine and heard the Grand Master's terrible summons now looked at each other with wide, fearful eyes. Before 40 days, he had said. The timeline had been met with chilling, almost supernatural precision. The first part of the curse was fulfilled. The king himself made a great show of indifference. He dismissed the Pope's death as a sad but natural event, a man of advanced years succumbing to a common ailment. He forbade any mention of the Templar's prophecy in his presence, his glare sharp enough to silence even the boldest of his nobles. Yet, a shadow had fallen across his face. This performance of stoicism fooled no one who knew him well. The king, usually so composed, had become prone to fits of temper. His sleep was troubled, and he would often be seen pacing the cold stone floors of his chambers late at night, a solitary figure wrestling with thoughts he dared not speak aloud. The curse had breached the palace walls. It had also breached the gates of Paris, taking root in the fertile soil of public imagination. The story of the burning, once a mere spectacle, was now recounted as a legend. In the taverns and marketplaces, the tale grew with each telling. De Molay had not just spoken, he had breathed fire. His eyes had glowed like embers as he pointed a charred finger toward Avignon. The prophecy began its journey, becoming a living thing, a piece of folklore that defined the era. It was a story of divine retribution, of a righteous man's final, terrible justice. The people, who had once watched in idle curiosity, now spoke the name of the last Grand Master with a mixture of awe and terror. He had become a ghost haunting the kingdom. Philip, in his pursuit of absolute power, had always understood the importance of symbols. He had used the law and the church to sanctify his actions, to present the destruction of the Templars as a holy necessity. Now, the men he had burned had become a more powerful symbol in death than he ever was in life, a martyr whose final words held the weight of divine truth. The vast Templar treasure, now absorbed into the royal coffers, felt tainted. The gold and silver that were meant to secure his kingdom's future now seemed like a cursed hoard, each coin a small token of damnation. The wealth had been the motive, but it offered no comfort now. It was the price of a king's soul, and the payment was coming due. He threw himself into the business of the state with a renewed ferocity, as if constant activity could ward off the encroaching dread. He signed edicts, met with ministers, and planned new campaigns. But it was a hollow distraction. In the quiet moments, in the space between one decree and the next, the echo of the pyre would return to him. Within this year, you will follow. He began to see omens in the mundane. A black crow landing on his windowsill was a messenger from the grave. A sudden storm that rattled the palace windows was the rage of heaven itself. The world, once a place he could bend to his will, had become a tapestry of threatening signs, all pointing toward his own prophesied end. His physicians noted the change. The king's robust health, his iron constitution, began to show fine cracks. His appetite waned, and a pallor settled beneath his skin. They offered remedies and tonics, speaking of humors and imbalances, but they could not prescribe a cure for a disease of the soul. Philip was being consumed by his own fear. He felt an increasing sense of isolation. The very courtiers who had once praised his cunning in dismantling the Templars now avoided his gaze. He saw accusation in their silence. Did they believe it too? Did they look upon him and see a dead man walking, a king whose time was measured not in years, but in the remaining months of a curse? His family, too, felt the chill. His sons, the future of his dynasty, seemed like strangers. He looked at them and saw the final, terrible clause of the prophecy, you and your lineage. Was this the true price of the Templar gold? Not just his own life, but the ruin of the House of Capet, the dynasty he had fought so ruthlessly to strengthen. The memory of de Molay's face in the fire became a recurring vision. Not a face contorted in pain, but one of serene, terrifying judgment. It was the face of a man who had seen the gears of divine justice begin to turn and knew that his own suffering was merely the prelude. Philip had lit the fire, but it was de Molay who now controlled the flames. He tried to pray, to seek solace in the very faith he had manipulated for his own ends. But the words felt hollow in his mouth. The God he spoke to felt distant, silent, or worse, felt like an ally of the men he had murdered. The stone saints in his private chapel seemed to watch him with cold, unforgiving eyes. There was no comfort to be found in heaven. As spring turned to summer, the kingdom Philip had built felt increasingly fragile. His grip on power was as absolute as ever, but his grip on his own peace of mind was gone. He was the most powerful man in France, yet he was a prisoner of a dead man's words, counting the days, watching the seasons change, and waiting for the final part of the prophecy to claim him. The summer and autumn of the year 1314 were marked by a series of misfortunes for the French kingdom. A palpable gloom settled over the land, a sense that the heavens themselves had turned their face away. The sun seemed to shine with less warmth, and the harvests, though not disastrous, were strangely meager, as if the soil itself was soured by some unseen blight. Then came the news that struck closer to the heart of power. Guillaume de Nogaret, the king's keeper of the seal, the brilliant and ruthless jurist who had been the chief architect of the Templars' downfall, was dead. His end was not on a battlefield or from a lingering illness, but was sudden, mysterious, and deeply unsettling. One day he was the king's most trusted advisor, the next, he was a corpse. There was no clear cause. Some said he was poisoned, a common enough end for men of his station. Others whispered of a sudden, violent seizure that had left him breathless and blue. But no one could say for sure. His death was a void, an unnerving question mark that hung over the royal court. In the absence of truth, superstition rushed in to fill the space. The whispers connected him inevitably to the curse. De Nogaret had drafted the accusations, coached the witnesses, and overseen the brutal interrogations. His intellect had been the anvil upon which the Order's destruction was forged. Now, he too had been summoned to answer for his role, another name struck from the ledger by the ghost of the Grand Master. The royal treasury, which should have been overflowing with the confiscated wealth of the Order, began to empty with an inexplicable speed. The Templar gold, seized with such ruthless efficiency, now seemed to melt away like snow in the sun. It was as if the coins themselves were cursed, bringing ruin to whatever they touched. Vast sums were lost in ill-advised ventures. A new tax, meant to stabilize the kingdom's finances, yielded barely half of what was projected. A shipment of silver, sent to fund a border campaign, vanished, the guards found slain by unknown assailants. It was a cascade of fiscal disasters, a bleeding of wealth that no minister could stanch. Philip's great prize was turning to dust in his hands. As the kingdom's fortunes dwindled, so too did the king's spirit. Philip the Fair, once a man of iron will and unshakable composure, grew increasingly morose and withdrawn. He abandoned the public duties he had once performed with such regal grace, preferring the solitude of his private chambers. A darkness had taken root in him, and it was visible to all. The true torment began when the sun went down. Sleep, once a refuge, became a nightly ordeal. He was haunted by nightmares, each one a variation on the same horrific theme. He would find himself back on the banks of the Seine, the heat of the pyre on his face, the smell of burning flesh in his nostrils. The crowd would be silent, their faces turned toward him in accusation. And from the heart of the inferno, the figure of Jacques de Molay would emerge, his body wreathed in flames but untouched by them. The Grand Master's eyes would lock onto his, and he would slowly raise a burning hand, his finger pointing directly at the king. No words were needed. The gesture was a sentence, a promise of a shared damnation that drew closer with each passing night. Philip would awake with a strangled cry, his body drenched in a cold sweat, the phantom smell of smoke lingering in the air. He would sit for hours in the darkness, the silence of the palace amplifying the frantic beating of his own heart. The most powerful monarch in Christendom was terrified of closing his eyes, held captive by the ghost of a man he had reduced to ash. This fear began to seep out from the king's chambers, a subtle poison that contaminated the atmosphere of the entire court. A heavy, watchful silence became the new etiquette. Laughter was rare and quickly stifled. Courtiers moved through the halls of the Louvre with a furtive caution, as if a wrong step might awaken a slumbering beast. They spoke of the king's illness in hushed tones, but they all knew its true name. It was the Templar's curse. It was a fear that was as tangible as the cold stone of the palace walls. The kingdom was being ruled by a haunted man, and his fear was becoming their own. The fate of France was now tied to the unraveling of one man's soul. He began to suspect everyone around him. Was that minister's advice a genuine attempt to help, or a subtle trap? Did that guard's glance linger a moment too long? He saw plots in shadows and betrayal in friendly gestures. The web of intrigue he had so masterfully woven to ensnare his enemies now seemed to be closing in around him. His sons, once the focus of his dynastic pride, became sources of anxiety. He would study their faces, searching for signs of weakness or ambition, wondering which of them might be eager to see the prophecy fulfilled. The curse had not only targeted him, it had poisoned the very bonds of his own family, turning love and loyalty into suspicion and fear. The physical toll of this relentless terror was stark. The king's features, once handsome and commanding, became sharp and gaunt. His hair thinned, and his eyes, once a piercing blue, were now clouded with a permanent exhaustion. He looked like a man who was being hollowed out from within, his life force slowly draining away, leaving only a brittle shell behind. Autumn deepened, the leaves turning to gold and rust, mirroring the decay that had taken hold of the king. The year was waning, and the deadline set by the burning men on the island was approaching. The entire kingdom, from the highest noble to the lowliest peasant, seemed to be holding its breath. The curse had been spoken. It had been partially fulfilled. All that remained was to wait for the final, inevitable act. In late November, with the trees bare and the sky the color of lead, a restless energy seized the king. The year prophesied by the men in the fire was drawing to its close, and the walls of the palace had become a cage for his terror. In a desperate flight from his own mind, King Philip IV announced he would go hunting in the forests of Fontainebleau. It was an attempt to reclaim a part of himself he had lost, the vigorous, commanding monarch who feared nothing. The hunt was a ritual of power, a display of dominance over the natural world. Perhaps, he thought, by chasing and killing a beast, he could for a moment silence the ghost that was chasing and killing him. The hunting party set out at dawn, a somber procession beneath a gray sky. There was none of the usual boisterous cheer. The hounds whined nervously, and the nobles rode in tight-lipped silence, their eyes fixed on the gaunt figure of their king. He rode flawlessly, his posture erect, but his face was a mask of grim determination. For hours, they rode through the skeletal woods. The air was cold and still, the silence broken only by the thud of hooves on the damp earth. Philip's gaze was distant, unfocused. He seemed to be listening for something other than the snap of a twig, a sound only he could hear, the echo of a voice from a pyre. Then, a magnificent stag broke from a thicket, its antlers like a thorny crown. The chase was on. For a fleeting moment, the old fire returned to the king's eyes. He spurred his horse, the thrill of the pursuit a potent drug, momentarily washing away the dread. The wind whipped at his face, and the baying of the hounds was a glorious, savage music. He was the king again, a hunter at the peak of his power, closing in on his prey. He urged his steed faster, leaping a fallen log, his focus narrowed to the fleeing animal. It was in this moment of fierce, primal concentration, this briefest of escapes from his fate, that his fate chose to find him. His horse, a powerful and trusted warhorse, stumbled on a hidden route. The animal's momentum was its undoing. It pitched forward with a terrified scream, and the king was thrown from the saddle. He flew through the air for a weightless instant before landing with a sickening crack, his head striking a stone hidden beneath the autumn leaves. The world went silent. The chase halted abruptly. The nobles and attendants reined in their horses, their faces frozen in horror. They scrambled from their mounts and rushed to the king's side. He lay unnaturally still, a trickle of blood matting his hair and staining the damp earth. His eyes were closed. He did not move. Panic erupted. The royal physicians were summoned, their faces paling as they examined the monarch. The blow to the head was severe. He was alive, but only just, his breathing shallow and faint. The hunt was over. A new, far grimmer procession began, the slow, careful journey to carry the broken body of the king back to the palace at Fontainebleau. There, in the grand royal bedchamber, he lay for weeks, a still and silent figure adrift on an ocean of velvet and silk. He never regained consciousness. He was suspended in a twilight world, a prisoner in the wreckage of his own mind. The most powerful men in France had been undone not by an assassin's blade or a rival army, but by a simple, random accident. Or was it random? No one in the kingdom believed so. From the kitchens to the great hall, the whispers were unanimous. The horse had not merely stumbled, it had been tripped by an unseen hand. The stone had not been lying in wait, it had been placed there by a vengeful spirit. This was the curse, delivering its final, brutal stroke. The greatest physicians in the land gathered at his bedside, their faces a gallery of impotence. They applied poultices, bled him, and recited prayers, but nothing could stir him. He remained lost to them, his soul already claimed by the judgment he had been summoned to. His body was merely waiting for the summons to be complete. The palace became a place of hushed vigil. Courtiers spoke in whispers, their rustling silks the only sound in the long, cold corridors. In the chapel, prayers for the king's recovery were offered ceaselessly, but they felt like hollow words spoken into a void. It was as if God had already passed his sentence and would hear no appeal. On the 29th day of November, the waiting ended. With his sons and closest advisers gathered around the bed, the king's shallow breathing faltered, and then stopped. There was no final struggle, no deathbed confession. Philip the Fair, the Iron King, simply ceased to exist. He had died just a few months before the one-year anniversary of the execution. A profound silence descended upon the room, heavier than any grief. They looked at the still form on the bed, and they saw not just a dead king, but a fulfilled prophecy. The curse was complete. The words spoken from the heart of a fire had proven more powerful than the might of the French throne. Jacques de Molay had kept his word. But the story did not end there. The deaths of a pope and a king were merely the prelude, the opening chords of a symphony of ruin composed from a pyre. The true and lasting consequence was not simply the fulfillment of a curse, but the complete unraveling of the world that had pronounced the sentence. The echo of the flames was just beginning its work. The first thread to snap was the most crucial, the royal lineage. The final part of de Molay's prophecy had been the most terrible: you and your lineage. Philip the Fair left behind 3 strong sons to secure the dynasty he had fought so ruthlessly to empower. But the curse had settled deep in their blood, a slow and patient poison. His eldest son, Louis X, inherited a throne draped in shadow. His reign was short, lasting less than 2 years, and was marked by discord, famine, and the scandalous affairs of his wife. He was a weak branch on a dying tree, and he snapped easily, leaving the kingdom in turmoil and the succession hanging by the thread of an unborn child. That child, a boy named John I, was born a king but died 5 days later. He was a monarch only in his cradle and his coffin, a tragic punctuation mark in the decline of his house. With his death, the direct, unbroken line of succession from father to son, a sacred chain stretching back for 3 centuries, was broken for the first time. The throne passed to Philip's second son, Philip V. He ruled for a mere 6 years, a reign spent battling for legitimacy and struggling against the ill fortune that now seemed endemic to the crown. He too failed to produce a male heir to succeed him, and the crown passed once more, this time to the last of the brothers. Charles IV, the final son of Philip the Fair, ascended the throne. His own 6-year reign was as fruitless as his brother's. When he died, he also left no son. Within 14 years of Jacques de Molay's execution, all 3 of Philip's male heirs were dead, and the direct line of the House of Capet was extinguished forever. The curse had been methodical, patient, and absolute. It had not just claimed the king, it had dismantled his entire legacy, plunging the kingdom into a succession crisis that would directly lead to the devastating 100 Years' War with England. The ghost of the Grand Master had bequeathed a century of conflict to the nation that had condemned him. And what of the great treasure, the motive for this vast and bloody crime? The wealth of the Templars, which was to have made the French crown the most powerful in Europe, simply vanished. It brought no prosperity, funded no golden age. Instead, it behaved like cursed gold from a dragon's hoard in some ancient fable. It was squandered on disastrous wars and foolish ventures. It flowed through the royal coffers like water through a sieve, disappearing into the pockets of corrupt officials or lost to mismanagement. The kingdom grew poorer, not richer. The treasure was a mirage that had led Philip and his kingdom into a desert of ruin from which they would not escape. But the most unexpected and enduring consequence was not the fall of a dynasty or the disappearance of wealth. The true outcome was not the fulfillment of the curse, but the birth of an indestructible legend. The physical fire that had consumed Jacques de Molay had ignited another, far more powerful fire in the imagination of the world. This new fire was the myth of the last Grand Master. He was no longer remembered merely as a historical figure, the head of a disgraced military order. In the taverns, in the courts, and in the secret societies that would later claim his lineage, he became a martyr, a prophet, and a symbol of righteous defiance against the corruption of earthly power. His curse was retold not as an act of desperate anger, but as a demonstration of a higher power. It was proof that there were forces in the world, secret knowledge, spiritual authority, that could not be touched by kings or popes. The Templars, in their destruction, became custodians of a truth that thrones and altars could not extinguish. The order that Philip had sought to erase from history was instead granted a form of immortality he could never have conceived. By burning their bodies, he had freed their spirit. The Knights Templar ceased to be an organization of flesh and blood and were reborn as an idea, a powerful and enduring myth of lost secrets, hidden treasures, and a sacred mission that transcended death. The flames on that small island in the Seine had been a crucible. They had burned away the temporal, political body of the order, an organization that had, perhaps, run its course. But in that same fire, the legend was forged, purified, and made eternal. The ashes scattered in the river were seeds from which 1,000 stories would grow. Over the centuries, that legend would only expand, weaving itself into the very fabric of Western mysticism. The burned man became a timeless icon of resistance, his last words a creed for all who believe that justice, however long delayed, is ultimately inescapable. The curse had been a sentence, but the myth became a verdict. In the end, Philip the Fair had achieved the opposite of his goals. He had sought to make his dynasty eternal and had seen it wither and die. He had sought to seize a great treasure and found only ashes. He had sought to destroy the Knights Templar, and had instead ensured that their name would be remembered forever, long after his own was a mere footnote in the annals of forgotten kings. The burned order had become something far greater than it had ever been in life.